This video is a summary of the RDMMA, the Responsible Decision-Making Model for Athletics, developed by Yiamouyiannis et al. In 2010. So this framework, this theoretical model, is going to be the foundation for you to think about various aspects that are presented within the textbook for this course, and also will be used specifically within two larger assignments for the course. The first is the ethics interview, in which you will use the RDMMA to analyze or evaluate the decision-making process of another person within a sport management position. And the second way that you'll use it is when evaluating the cases or the singular case that you select for the ethical dilemma analysis. So beyond this video, where I'll expand on the model, there's also a very brief Word document on D2L summarizing these steps, but I recommend bookmarking this video and having it be something that you can go back to over time. So a lot of times when it comes to management disciplines, there are two different camps of people that operate and have a certain core set of beliefs. And a lot of times these are operating in two different silos, and these two groups can butt heads or act in opposition to each other. The first are researchers, the second are practitioners. And I think a lot of times what can get really confusing is that if you're a researcher or if you are someone whose boots are on the ground, you're a practitioner, a lot of times we don't see the value in the other perspective, or we think that we know better because we are on one side or in one circle over another. And how we see this really come into play when we think about leadership is evidence-based practices. So this is something that scholars, academics, researchers will use. They will use scientific rigor to prove that this is the best way to do something. And then we have practice-based evidence. And this is a lot of times what practitioners will use as arguments to say, well, I have a lot of experience in doing X, Y, and Z. This is how it should be done. Now, the problem with operating only in one silo over another is if you operate solely in the evidence-based practices world, a lot of times your decision-making process could lack a certain practicality. And thinking about in an ideal world, this would be a great solution to the problem. However, the real world is a little bit more gray, and we have to be able to recognize that the practical side of our behaviors and our thought processes are extremely important when making decisions. The issues with operating solely within the practice-based evidence silo is that we can get caught up sometimes in two different things. One, ignoring or not recognizing our own blind spots, whether that's something from personal experiences, the biases or stereotypes that we hold about individuals or situations. We might not always be able to see all of that because we're operating in, this is how I've done it before. The second issue with operating within this camp alone is perpetuating the notion, especially within athletics, of, well, this is the way it's always been done and this is how we should do it. Athletics, like a lot of other organizations, disciplines within our world, is something that is constantly evolving and changing. Your textbook was written in 2021 before the name, image, and likeness NIL legislation was approved in July of 2021. We know now that there are increased ethical concerns, not just within sport related to NIL, but now we have technology and artificial intelligence. ChatGPT was not a thing when the textbook was released. So the world is constantly updating. And if we get caught up in this trap of this is the way that it's always been done, we might not be performing optimally. And we might also still be leaving out groups that we've always left out in athletics based on discriminatory traditions, practices, or beliefs. So therefore, using a model like the RDMMA is an opportunity for us to blend together academic theory, evidence-based practice, alongside with practical evidence, practice-based evidence. So it's sort of this blend between these two different camps and allows us to really look at the sweet spot for decision-making. And in doing all of that, we're able to make perhaps the most informed decision that we can make when it comes to ethical dilemmas, because I think everybody wants to ideally try to come up with the best case scenario. But even in saying that, sometimes we're leaving out important elements to our decision-making process. So the goal of the RDMMA is to be able to blend together these two fields and ultimately, beyond that, add a third component within it, and that's situational demands. So we're looking at academic theory and what scholarship in a variety of disciplines have looked at. We're looking at our own personal experiences, either our own or perhaps our classmates when thinking about different ethical situations. And finally, the situational demands, because depending on the context of the situation, depending on the scenario that you encounter, whether hypothetically in this class or actually in real life, it requires us to adjust our thinking and continually reassess our priorities. So the goal of the RDMMA is to provide a framework that you can go back to for this course, but also in the future, a sort of series of steps that you can think about to come up with this area in the middle here on the screen, a blend and informed decision that incorporates evidence-based practices, practice-based evidence, and also meets the situational demands. So enter in the RDMMA. Essentially, this was an article published by the individuals up on the screen and a sport management education journal, and has been used in a variety of different courses and in real life scenarios since then. So to briefly introduce you to the RDMMA, this is essentially an 8-step framework that sport management professionals, especially within intercollegiate and interscholastic settings, have used to guide their decision-making processes. Every step within this model, it's considered to be a pluralistic model, a pluralistic approach, which basically means that it's incorporating a variety of different theories and sort of blending them together to create this, again, nuanced view of a problem or a situation. So some of the theories that have been used lie within psychological theory, mainly within conflict management. Then we have sport management and administration scholarship. So that's developed by the author speaking with professionals from a variety of different settings with a variety of different resources to come up with a list of things to consider. And then business management and leadership theory, mainly relying here on stakeholder theory and situations and frameworks like that. So like I said before, this is essentially just a way for us to bridge that gap between academic theory and practice, and a way for individuals to sort of safeguard against immediately falling into the way that things have always been done. So now I'll go into each step briefly and describe them. Step 1 is identify the problem. Essentially, this is just looking at the situation at face value, being able to identify the problem or the issue at hand. Is there or are there any broader problems that sort of overlay or intersect with the presented situation? Step 2 is determining decision objectives. So essentially what this here is looking at are like, what are the greater philosophies that interact with the decision that needs to be made? Is there a philosophy, mission statement of your organization? I hope that there is, right? Is there a philosophy for your conference, division, professional association, things like that? A lot of times we think about this of like the Division 3 philosophy is very different than the Division 1 philosophy in intercollegiate athletics. And then you're looking at like really what decisions need to be made and how do they align with the bottom line. And the bottom line in athletics and in a lot of ways boils down to 2 different things. The first is the human component, like how is this going to impact the humans that are within my organization? And 2, the financial component, can I afford it? Step 3 is broken down into 2 sub-steps. The first is recognizing key stakeholders. So basically, stakeholders at a very general sense are just individuals who are invested in the operations of your organization. We can think about stakeholders in two different ways. Internal. So internal stakeholders are those that are internal within your organization. So student athletes, coaches, faculty, staff. Then external stakeholders are the individuals that exist outside of your organization, but are still invested in what's going on. So parents, especially at the collegiate level, parents, alumni, fans, donors, community members, especially for the interscholastic, intercollegiate, and professional levels. So really, to ensure a long-term successful navigation of dilemmas, there has to be this two-way dialogue between stakeholders and the decision makers to understand really what the ripple effects of a decision have, long-term and short-term for an organization. So here's a quick figure that the authors provided for an intercollegiate athletics department. You can see up here on the screen, there are 11 different stakeholders here listed, and I'm sure that there are some that are not listed on here that have become more prevalent over the last few years than others. And so each stakeholder, their stake, their investment per se, differs depending on their relationship to the university and also depending on the context at hand. But it's important to recognize that there are a lot of people who are impacted by the decisions that you make, especially if you're in a leadership position, a management position, or somebody's looking at you as a boss. Step 3B, the second part of 3, involves recognizing key influences, and this is broken down into 2 areas. The first is environmental, and the basic question that's guiding this is like, what impacts your decision that's essentially out of your control? So rules, regulations, state laws, federal laws, pressure from stakeholder groups, budgetary constraints, perhaps budgetary constraints you might have a little bit of control over if you can sort of reallocate the budget. The second subtype or aspect and key influences to consider is just the characteristics of the decision makers that you surround yourself by. So again, even though you might be in charge of a team, you might be the head coach of the team, you still have people that you have to report to, right? You still report to an athletic director or perhaps another athletic administrator. In certain schools, coaches are also faculty members, so they might also report to the provost. If you're an athletic director in a high school setting, you might report to the principal, you might report to the superintendent. It all depends on what's listed in your contract. So understanding the philosophies, beliefs, backgrounds, and level of moral reasoning, if I'm being really honest, of these individuals is critical to making sure that you are making a decision that aligns with the values of the organization and is able to uphold the particular ethics involved. Step 4 involves gathering and reviewing information. Essentially, this is like doing your homework and collecting your evidence. The first thing that you should do whenever a crisis arises is stop everything, clear your desk, and make sure that you're paying attention to what's going on and not making any decisions that are brash in nature. And when I say brash, I mean uninformed. So being able to collect information internal, whether that's through documents, emails, talking to relative constituents within your organization, coworkers, and then external to your situation or your organization. So asking for advice from peers, from colleagues, right? Being able to approach somebody else and say, this is kind of what I'm facing. Can I explain this to you? And in explaining it, you might have your answer. Or saying, have you ever dealt with something different or similar to this, and how did you handle it? As a note for your project, your ethics interview, this might be a good question to ask the person that you're interviewing. And for your ethical dilemma analysis, especially with the cases, there are various appendices provided for gathering and reviewing information, and that's what I'm expecting you to do for step 4. If you need to use any outside information, that's totally fine. Please just cite it. Step 5 relates to identifying hurdles. So what are the roadblocks, the barriers that could prevent you from making this decision or making the best decision that you can? So financial challenges, perhaps facility limitations, budget management issues, potential reactions from stakeholder groups. I'm sure there's a lot of different things that I don't even have up here listed up on the screen. And again, this is all because it's all situationally dependent. Step 6 is identifying and assessing alternatives. So basically, this is a big brainstorming session for solutions and then beginning the process of narrowing those down. A lot of times people will do like a cost benefit analysis, a pro con list. Everybody operates differently, but following your pattern of sort of assessing those solutions is important to land on the correct one. Step 7 involves making a responsible decision. These are some guiding questions here based on ethical theories in terms of like, are you achieving your objectives? Are you respecting the rights of your stakeholders? Is your decision considered fair? Are you acting in accordance with your values? And I want to retract something I just said a minute ago, making the right decision. I don't know if there's a right decision for every single situation, because every situation has a different set of facts, different people involved, but it's about being able to make a decision that you feel is the most ethical and one that helps the most amount of people or addresses the situation at hand the best that you can in that moment. And I think there's a lot of pressure between, doing the right thing. And I think sometimes you just have to be able to work off of the information that you have and be able to make the most responsible decision with the presented facts. The final step is going back and evaluating your decision outcomes. This is a step that a lot of people don't often take, especially when they're working in a position that's fast-paced and there's a lot of responsibilities. It's critical as a leader to be able to go back and think about the decisions that you made. How did it impact people? Was it successful? What changes do I have to make? What can I be doing better? What should I continue to do? Now, for your projects, for the ethics interview, this is something that you can ask someone. Did you go back and think about what you did? Did you act differently another time? And then within the ethical dilemma analysis, being able to hypothetically or ideally discuss what you would do is needed for that. So I'm going to go through a really brief hypothetical scenario now, applying the 8 steps of the RDMMA to this scenario to sort of give you an example. So let's say you're an athletic director at a small university in the United States. You were offered a substantial donation by a local pharmaceutical company, and they desire with that donation to have their organization's name branded outside of the school, the football team's stadium bleachers. Now, the dilemma with this is the company has recently been under fire in the media for rumored unethical scientific practices. Nothing has been brought into court, nothing has been proven yet. And this type of donation, especially this size, would be absolutely transformative for your athletic department. And it would provide not just an upgrade to the football stadium, but all other facilities considering its size. Step 1, identifying the problem. So the conflict in this situation is get a big financial benefit in accepting the money, but then there's also some ethical implications of associating with a pharmaceutical company that might have questionable scientific practices. So you're juggling between those moral values, normative principles, and a non-moral motive, right, which is money and wealth. Step 2, thinking about your decision objectives. Like, what's the purpose of sport and what's the purpose of athletics in the first place? Like, is it to have fun? Is it to play? Is it to win? Thinking about what that means for you, for your institution, for your organization. How should the actions of athletic departments align with universities? How should it align with the law? Like, all of these things are things to consider when thinking about your decision objectives. Key stakeholders, again, broken down into internal and external stakeholders. So here, like, what would be the effect of accepting this substantial donation on student athletes? Is that different for coaches and administrators? How would faculty think about this at a university? When we think about external stakeholders, we're considering, like, how would parents feel about this decision? Alumni, donors, community members, what would they have to say about accepting this money? Key influences for here, broken down into environmental and characteristics of decision makers. What are the rules and regulations of universities for accepting money? Are there Title IX implications? How does that play into your decision? Are you getting any pressure from other stakeholders? Perhaps there's a board member in the board of trustees that works at this pharmaceutical company. So is there any type of internal influence there for you to take it? Then when we think about characteristics of decision makers, like how would the university president feel about this, the board of trustees? This is all information that obviously I can't answer in this hypothetical scenario, but a way for you to think about it. Step 4 involves gathering and reviewing information. So thinking about who would you want to meet with ideally? What would you be discussing? What type of information do you need to make an informed decision? Step 5, identifying hurdles. I've highlighted here the one that I think would be probably most relevant in this situation, which would just be, what are the reactions from the stakeholder groups that are potentially impacted by this decision? So we're looking at here, like, what would be reported in the media about this? What would alumni have to say about this? What would faculty and university administration have to say about this? So identifying those reactions and potentially trying to get ahead of it in any way, if this was a real scenario, is critical. Step 6 involves identifying and assessing alternatives. In this scenario, I think it can kind of be boiled down into 3 potential solutions: accept the money, accept it with some type of restriction, or you deny the donation. But again, depending on the situation, these bullet points might change depending on how many sort of gray areas there are within the situation at hand. Step 7, making a responsible decision. As I mentioned before, like, are you acting in accordance with your own values or motives? Being able to take a really hard look at yourself, especially as a leader, as someone in a position of power, is absolutely necessary in order to make an ethical decision. It might not be perfect, but it can be responsible and ethical, especially considering how it could impact other people. And finally, step 8 is all dependent on whatever decision you made within this hypothetical scenario or within one that you encounter in your everyday life. Being able to continually think about how you've acted and what you would like to do differently the next time. So again, this wraps up our video for the responsible decision-making model for athletics, the RDMMA. More information about this model can be found on D2L, and if you have any questions for me about it, please reach out.